get going.
Please receive the message for recording.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the second edition of the Telegrams from War-Struck Ukraine series, where we talk about life, society, and the economy in times of the Russian war in Ukraine. We've organized this series in collaboration with the School of Economics, but more broadly, the Social Science faculty and Humanities faculty at the University of East Anglia. And we have distinguished guests from different parts of the academia, mostly from Ukraine or Ukrainian based elsewhere in the world, who are going to talk to us about how the conflict has impacted on society in Ukraine, what led to the conflict, and what can be done to pull the plug on this horrific shock that we're witnessing. And so today is Telegram 2, we call it. We talk about where the responsibilities lie. So we look at the angle of where are the causes for this conflict, and we actually focus on strategic corruption and how Russian elites entangled with Western politics have created an international web of corruption, which has or has not, we will see, in some ways fueled this war. And of course, what can be done about it? And we have with us today a very nice lineup of guests who are going to participate in a roundtable discussion. We have Ina Melnykovska, who is based at the Central European University. We have Joseph Pozsgai Alvarez, who is based at the Osaka University in Japan. We have Oksana Huss, who is based at the University of Bologna, and Kateryna Boguslavska, who is based at the Basel Institute of Governance. Thank you all very much for coming. And here to lead the discussion today, we have Oleksandra Keudel, who is affiliated with the Kyiv School of Economics and is specialized in political science. And we also have Francis King, who is here from the Faculty of History at UEA and has a very strong interest in Eastern European democracies. So thank you again very much. And I would like us to take maybe 1 minute to go through the list of panelists, and for you all to tell us a little bit about your main area of focus in research. So please, could we start with Oksana? Thank you.
Thank you for this invitation. As you said, I'm working with the BTECT project at the University of Bologna right now, and we are investigating social movements and information technologies used against corruption. And before that, I'm working meanwhile almost for 10 years on political corruption in Ukraine and also anti-corruption activism on the local level of governance in Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Ina, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So thank you, Oana, for inviting and organizing this panel. I'm assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at Central European University in Vienna. My research is about business-state relations in post-Soviet countries, with particular focus, among others, on Russian business-state relations, on the system of political-economic relations, usually labeled crony capitalism in Russia. And my recent project is about integration of Russian big business into global financial flows.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Joseph.
Yes, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I am, as you mentioned, associate professor at the Osaka University. Before Osaka, I spent a few years also in Kyoto University. I am originally from Peru. I've been involved in anti-corruption research for the last 12 years. My focus is mostly on the politics of anti-corruption and the measurement of corruption.
Thank you very much. And Kateryna.
Hello, it's my pleasure to join this important discussion. I'm joining from the Basel Institute on Governance. I am here leading the Basel Anti-Money Laundering Index, which is a tool to measure risks of money laundering and terrorist financing across globe. So it's clear my area of responsibility or interest is money laundering, illicit financial flows, sanctions, and all issues related to that. For sure, corruption as a predicate offense of money laundering.
Okay, thank you all very much. And I'm sure that all of your expertise will feed into a very, very insightful discussion, which then I'm going to let Oleksandra lead on the questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Oana, for the introductions. And I will jump right away into our discussion. So my first question is, let us look at the nature of the business and state relationships in Russia. And since this is now the main aggressor in the war, we want to understand how strategic corruption shaped these relationships between the business and state in Russia. And I would like Ina to start and the other experts to jump in.
Okay, thank you, Oleksandra. I think it's a good question to start the discussion to understand what is the animal that we are talking about. And so the political economic system of crony capitalism in Russia is usually described in popular discussions as state dominance or state capture. I think it's somehow misleading labels that are used because they indicate that someone is the benefiter while someone in those relations is a victim. And usually Russian businesses, especially nowadays, point to their victim positioning. This is, however, not true. In reality, Russian crony capitalism is a mutually beneficial symbiosis of political and business actors involved in this relationship. So, of course, political actors in the Kremlin benefit in terms of certain financial resources, some a kind of water mobilizing resources, or even legitimation in the West, strategies provided by businesses. But from the other side, Russian big business make profits through their connections to the Kremlin. For example, they get some procurement deals, or they are allowed to go through certain schemes of friend-seeking that helps them to accumulate certain wealth and assets. Another feature of this system, nevertheless, that it's highly hierarchical. So making money depends there very much on the proximity of the business to the feeder, to Kormushka in Russian words. Apparently the main proximity depends on the personal closeness of businesses to Vladimir Putin. And then there is another feature of this crony capitalism that relates to property rights, yes, so to the security of accumulated assets. And again, it's not the rule of law that provides the security, but rather the proximity to political power, which can be a sort of political shelter for Russian businesses to function and to get the benefit of their accumulated wealth. And probably the last feature that I think needs to be highlighted is that Russian crony capitalism does not stop on Russian national borders. It is not isolated. It is highly integrated into global economic and financial markets. So we have, at least since those Panama Papers, Paradise Papers, and other papers, a clear evidence that how Russian entities, how Russian businesses are involved into illicit capital flows that go through Western jurisdictions. So, of course, their purpose is, first of all, to hide that accumulated wealth, to avoid taxation. The other part of this globalization relates to not just to a kind of passive parking of the wealth, but using this integration into active corporate activities. Yes, so there are certain rent-seeking schemes. Schemes of money making that goes beyond Russian borders, and so this global capital mobility is the part of this a kind of rent-seeking activities of Russian businesses. And the last point, which also need to be mentioned, that sometimes this offshoreization of corporate activities could be used even for very legal activities. So offshoreization is the part of such borrowing activities at international financial markets, as issuing euro bonds, as offering stock shares of Russian holdings at international stock exchanges, or as taking credits from foreign international banks. Yes, so probably we can have a sort of differentiated perspective on this integration of Russian businesses, that there is some part that is rather passive, illicit. There is another part in these activities that relates to rent-seeking activities, and there is the third one that is more transparent, more conditional on certain standards of corporate kind of culture and business doing, transparent business doing related to this legal financial integration.
Thank you very much, Ina, for such an input. I see here two topics that you already covered. So sort of the system, the political economic system in Russia, and the entanglement of the state and the economic actors, and what it does to the West. So before we go to how it works in the West, I would like also to let perhaps Oksana would like to add on the, what is this? Is this something special for Russia? Is this something, could we call it a post-Soviet system? What are the peculiarities and maybe mechanisms that sustain this system, if you would like to go in more detail?
Thank you, Oleksandra. Complementary to what Ina said, I would like to elaborate more indeed on the specific of this post-Soviet type corruption, or even corruption in the Soviet times, the functions of it, because Russia in many ways still is functioning based on the KGB logic and the logic of the Soviet time. And one important point that scholars in the West are missing, because they are considering corruption as in the first line as the goal for private enrichment. So that the goal of corruption is purely monetary enrichment or economic enrichment of the individuals. Well, there is a special feature of function of corruption as a blackmail tool that was used broadly in the Soviet Union. And this is something I know from the research of corruption in Ukraine in the 90s. And this blackmail tool means that people are getting not only access to the resources to enrich themselves, but that this hierarchical part comes into a play that Ina elaborated on. And hierarchy comes from the possibility to control its people and to blackmail them, because the elites or the political elites, they have access to information who was doing what illegal things. And the mechanism of krugovaya poruka and of kompromat, these are Russian terms. So kompromat is this having some facts for blackmail. I would translate it in this way. And krugovaya poruka means that everyone is somehow to be blamed. And this is why if someone reveals some information about corruption, then it means blowing up all the circle, and no one is interested in doing that because everyone is somehow involved. So this function of a blackmail tool of the corruption is important also if we analyze strategic corruption towards the West or other countries that Russia has been exploiting. And the problem with that is that there was one colleague, Elena Konsevichute, who said it's not even strategic corruption, but this is rather tactical corruption. Because with strategic corruption, when we use this term, we imply that corruption is as a goal for private enrichment. And with the tactical corruption, we would say that there is some geostrategic goal that the state has. And if it exports corruption abroad, then there is a tactical function to it, to bring the other state into dependency or to have the possibility to blackmail. And this is in fact what we see now with the limited ability of countries like Germany to react and to impose sanctions, because it is possible to blackmail the country, in fact, based on this corruption-prone dependencies.
Wow, so we are now talking about tactical corruption and just destroyed the whole topic of our conversation. So I would like to, perhaps Kateryna, would you like to elaborate even more, right, on how these mechanisms work in this tactical corruption?
I think it is important to distinguish between corruption as a general issue in post-Soviet countries and how it is working in reality. So what is the big difference, for example, between organization of corruption and corrupt politicians in Ukraine and Russia? In Russia, we see the very hierarchical system. There is no competition between corrupt elites. This competition is impossible. In Ukraine, this competition always exists. Always. There is no possibility that there will be only one center of corrupt elites responsible for all decision-making process in the country. There is internal discussion, there is internal competition, and basically this moves Ukraine to the situation that we don't have this autocratic system imposed in Russia, because internal forces are in competition, even though we also have in Ukraine corruption, and it is indeed a very huge issue for the whole region. What we see in Moldova, for example, with the previous actor Plahotniuk, he also tried to build these systems similar to what exists in Russia to eliminate any other centers of decision making and trying to build the hierarchical structure, but he failed there. So I think this is important to distinguish between this, and for sure, if you have highly hierarchical system with no competition between elites, even though it's corrupt elites, they are all prone to be loyal, because this loyalty is just a matter of your survival. This is a bit different to the corruption practices that you would find in Ukraine or elsewhere in the post-Soviet states.
Thank you very much, Kateryna, for this addition. And Joseph?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to add, I don't know if we are already moving towards discussing this issue of strategic corruption in relation to Western countries. But I find that the general concept or the term in general of strategic corruption is not something that has been discussed or worked into for very long, at least, because it goes against the usual way that we discuss corruption in both academia and industry. Normally, we consider corruption an issue of development, and even when we're talking about political corruption, we're thinking about the mechanisms that are lacking or the lack of rule of law in order to control the corruption of the political elite in power. but it remains attached to the issue of development, both economic and political development of a country, in the way that is perceived by Western academia. And at the same time, it is always rooted at the national level. But what we're seeing in terms of the meaning or the importance of strategic corruption, especially for the current geopolitical circumstances that we're seeing in Eastern Europe, we cannot really approach that phenomenon by looking at one single country, because almost by definition, strategic corruption only appears when we move to the international level, when we get unrooted from the national level and we start discussing relationship between states. And not only states, but in this case, the importance of individuals or organizations, the third group that is not a state, but in many cases are as fundamental as the state themselves in supporting and fostering the role of strategic corruption for the geopolitics of this part of the world. So I know that we're going to talk a lot more about the role of Western actors in this situation, but I just wanted to adapt to what Kateryna was saying about and not just Kateryna, but Ina also, about the issue of hierarchy and the situation within Russia. And something that I have been finding very interesting for quite some time is that corruption really have different faces, but not because of the type of actors that get involved in it, but because how it's not a situation, it's not a condition of the regime, but it's rather an essence or essential element of the regime itself that explains why the regime exists in the first place. I mean, just looking at the case of Russia without considering that strategic corruption or many of the forms that we consider to be strategic nowadays, or at least tactical, can also be found in Kazakhstan. I mean, a former president Nazarbayev was involved in many of the same sort of schemes that now we identify around Moscow. But of course, we can differentiate corruption in Russia compared to corruption in other former Soviet Union. But still, the situation is that even when just looking at Russia, we can clearly differentiate the role that corruption had in prompting, or at least in the way that it was utilized by the emerging oligarchs in the 1990s, and the situation of those old oligarchs under the new regime of President Putin starting in the early 2000s. So even in Russia, we can differentiate, we can find two stages. Both of them could be connected to strategic corruption, but of course they will be deployed in different ways. So I think it's important to start disaggregating this rather large phenomenon that we can continue terming either strategic or tactical.
Right. So how about we maybe start disaggregating already today? And since we're having the focus on the West, basically the question is through which, in a way, what I hear is that Russia is kind of exporting its version of corruption to the West. And the question is through which perhaps mechanisms and processes, that also Western ones, that allow the Russian state to cement its influence in the West. For example, what allowed for such a level of penetration that we see today in the Western countries. And just to piggyback on what Ina said, maybe you would like to elaborate on this legitimation in the West, how this was happening through the Russian elites, and what kind of illicit or transparent, in fact, schemes were used to do that. Okay, sorry. Then Oksana raises the hand, and then I pass to Joseph.
Okay, thank you. I would like to bring up the very demonstrative example of engagement of Gerhard Schröder, former Chancellor of Germany, who in fact in the year when he ceased to be a Chancellor was engaged for the Gazprom for strategic purposes. In fact, two lobby activities of Russia in terms of energy supply for Europe. And what we see here as corruption mechanism is a revolving door. Why is it corruption and not only a private matter of one person? So in fact, in industry, we have this practice, if someone changes the company into the competing company, then there is always some half year or year time where the person kind of loses the information about the status quo to impede and to not allowed to take the information and all the knowledge and networks from one company to another one. And similar mechanisms should work actually also on the level revolving door between the state and or public offices and private sector. And it's even if we speak within the one country, not even for the interests of another country. So what is now introduced in Germany, this is this term of Karenzzeit, that there is a time that the politician has to take off between the office and being engaged in the private sector. So this rule of Karenzzeit, it wasn't in place back then. And Gerhard Schröder, in fact, took all his knowledge, networks, information from his public office as a chancellor, accumulated it and used for lobby of Russian energy interests for Europe. How is it connected to the war and to the conflict within Europe right now? Schröder, he took leading positions as the chairman of the shareholders committee of Nord Stream and chairman of the board of directors in the Nord Stream 2. Both projects are considered as strategic to exclude Ukraine from the liberation, from the transportation of gas from Russia to Europe. It means it increases dependency of Europe on Russian gas and excludes Ukraine from these flows. The second point, since 2015, also Gazprom is owning 1/4 of the gas tanks of the gas gas storage is the word, gas storage in Germany. And for the first time in this year, this storage was not replenished. It means that Germany didn't have enough gas in the storage to cover all the supply for energy for this year, especially under conditions when they have to react in forms of sanctions and introduce embargo against Russian gas and oil. So it brings in twofold way all Europe and especially Germany, but also entire Europe in the situation where they are not able to apply meaningful sanctions in a quick manner in order to punish Russia for the invasion of Ukraine. And the third point is, of course, that also thankfully to lobby work, and this is very nice work by Transparency International UK, who've done a report about lobby of Russian firms in the EU on the EU level. The alternative energy supplies through LSG tanks and LSG network was not elaborated, was not constructed, which again reinforced the dependence on Russian gas and Russian resources in Europe. So we see this direct dependency through such people, where Gerhard Schröder is one of the examples, but there are many across Europe in different countries.
Nice. I think Joseph would like to end.
I only have one small
Yes.
follow-up question, sorry if I may, because Oksana, you were talking about the fact that this has introduced a dependency, or this has facilitated the dependency of the Western economies on Russian resources. But my question is, the mere fact that the Western countries are paying the Russian state for these resources, does it mean that we are inherently financing the war in this way? Is it as simple as that?
To me or to everyone?
to you, and if anyone wants to chip in, that's
well,
absolutely
according to assessment, because the energy prices went up, Russia will receive the record revenue this year in comparison to previous years in terms of income, because of these very high prices for energy resources. And in this way, if we are trying on the one hand to cut Russia from all the economic flows, so there is no resources to buy, for example, from other countries, weapons or to fund simply this war, and in the same time paying this historical prices for the resources, for energy, for gas and oil and coal, I see there a very direct link to funding the war.
Thank you.
So I think Joseph would like to elaborate.
Yes, I actually had some other point that I wanted to make as well, but I would like to add something to Oksana's answer there. I may be a little more pessimistic because I honestly think that the let's say the corrupt relations between Russia and the West already paid for the war on Ukraine a long time ago, meaning that the condition, the financial and political condition that were required for Russia to engage in this attack were already fulfilled for some time now. So I'm not sure that sanctions at this point. I think that we are over that threshold of time. We missed that opportunity, and we missed an opportunity for a number of reasons. And this is where I would like to bring back my discussion to what I was saying earlier about the different types of strategic corruption. Because the example that Oksana gave is one of the three more, let's say, painfully simple ways of describing how strategic corruption has created this condition for the attack on Ukraine. For example, in the case of the Russian involvement in the U.S. elections of 2016, we have a clear example of what we may describe as direct strategic or tactical corruption, meaning the actual direct involvement of one state through corrupt means, or at least with the use of illicit finances to attack another sovereign state. But at the same time, we have these middle cases, the case that Oksana reflects, in which Russia and potentially other countries can use their economic power and economic strength to buy off politicians or influential actors in other states, both to serve as guarantors for the position of Russia in the way of lobbying, for example, but also in a way that makes it harder for the other country to disengage rapidly and automatically in case of Russian aggression. And then we have the most indirect, but I would say potentially one of the most difficult types of strategic corruption for Western powers to do anything about, which is that for many years, at least since before the fall of the Berlin Wall, Russia has already, or back then, the Soviet Union was already using the Western financial sector in order to launder their assets and to bring it back to Moscow in order to support the position of the political elite. And this is why I say that I believe that in case of sanctions, we have arrived a little too late for the war in Ukraine, because Putin had almost 20 years now to create the circle of financiers and political support to remain in power regardless of the outcome of this conflict. And this was only possible because the financial sector in the West were only too eager to accept corrupt money from Russia.
So Thank you for this addition. So no differentiation with what kind of money flows into the financial sector. Francis, I think you wanted to, and then Kateryna, or you had a question.
If I could jump in here and just introduce a bit more of a sort of historical thing. Joseph referred to the events of the 1990s. I don't know how the other panelists see the profoundly criminal and corrupt nature of the privatization process in Russia, in particular, but other states of the USSR itself, as one of the sort of motors and mechanisms for this kind of international corruption. It seems to me it takes place on two levels. Firstly, in the insecurity of the 1990s, when, having grabbed a certain tranche of assets, it was definitely a good idea to try to put it somewhere in a more stable jurisdiction, rather than try to keep it in Russia, where it was likely to be grabbed by somebody else given half a chance. And secondly, the fact that pretty much all the major privatizations were profoundly corrupt and criminal. It's given the Russian state, once it's got its act together in the early 2000s, a perfect lever to control all the business people, because anyone who steps out of line, your tax affairs can be investigated. They will be found to be completely corrupt because they are all completely corrupt, and you can have it taken away. We, it seems to me, in the West, chose to ignore where this money came from and just provided the services. But I think that's I don't know what other panelists think, but I think that's kind of an important part of how we've got to the state we're in at the moment, the very nature of the emergence of Russian and other ex-Soviet big business.
Thanks. So maybe Kateryna, you want to elaborate on how did we end up there?
Yeah, I think so. First of all, I would like to go back a bit to the money that we are paying to Russia for the oil and gas in Europe, and the number is the total amount of import is 158 billion of euros, and 60% of that is what Europe pays for fuel and mining products. So I think this is clear that this money goes for war, and we even know how much. If we speak about practicalities, how money came to the West, I would say that they used three basic stages, which are well known in money laundering. It's when they place the money, they stole through privatization or through other corrupt activities. They place them in the banking system, either in Russia or in the neighboring countries like Latvia, which served for quite a while as a center to Russian money to move from Russia, then to Baltic countries, and then to the West. Then they use the next stage, which is layering, when they use different proxies, offshore companies, trusts, and here we come to the question of transparency of beneficial ownership. So they use proxies to basically layer the money that they had. And the next stage would be integration. They almost have this money cleaned, so they could use them to buy property, to buy legal companies, to do legal business activities. So when we are now at the stage that almost all these businesses are integrated in the Western financial system, it is quite difficult to find this first step link that the money was of corrupt and illegal origin. So this is a huge issue now when we are imposing sanctions, also due to these facts that I mentioned, and due to the fact that most of them are either proxy money or those that look completely legal businesses.
Right, and that brings us to our second big question in this panel. So there are some sanctions that have been adopted. Considering what Kateryna just has mentioned, are these sanctions even possible to implement the way they intended, and what are their effects, and what can be done more? I will pose big questions. Inna, please.
Probably I will not answer all of them, but just sort of the idea about how to think about the effects of these sanctions and what to expect from them. So first of all, because of these networks, these illicit flows, these matryoshka schemes have this money coming into West, it would be very difficult to track them. Yes, so only those parts that happen to be more or less transparent due to these recent investigative journalist reports could be tracked back. But nevertheless, so there is a lot of room for these sanctions to be effective, but we would need to invest, we in the West, I mean, would need to invest a lot of resources, bureaucratic resources, to be able to monitor and to to implement those sanctions to be effective. What I also kind of know from my research and interviews, that sometimes even when sanctions were introduced in the past, and we started to target Russian money in the West already since Magnitsky list, so there were problems with implementation, yes, because there was just no state capacities in the Western capitals to track this money effectively. And then on the contrary, we have industry of enablers, of professional, legal, financial, and PR experts that help to hide those monies. And this sometimes only clicks on the computer that can help to transfer money from one jurisdiction to the other and just hide it again in some offshore jurisdiction. So more efforts needs to be there really to make the sanctions effective. The other issue is that in short-term a kind of perspective, these sanctions could have even a kind of reversal effect, yes, because they would rather make Russian big businesses even more dependent from the Kremlin, because it will cut some alternative sources of rent seeking. Those sanctions will also cut their possibility to secure their property rights through Western jurisdictions, through some arbitrage or whatever courts that are independent from the Russian state. So Russian state would be then back as on their agenda as the only one provider of property rights security and only one provider of rent-seeking possibilities. And indeed, I mean, there are some sanctions that were implemented already also since Magnitsky, but more intensively than after 2004, annexation of Crimea. And we saw that those businesses that were sanctions in the West, they turned to the Kremlin, asking for compensations for their losses. So they then get some large-scale investment projects such as Kerch Bridge, for example, or they get a great share of defense contracts, yes, to kind of to push for militarization of Russian army. So. But in the long term, nevertheless, there is capacity of these sanctions to bring probably Russian businesses to a kind of to be increasingly in the conflict, probably not so much in the conflict to the Kremlin, but at least the conflict at the horizontal level between each other, because if the pie of rent-seeking sources will be shrinking, then a kind of the number of those that can benefit from this pie will be narrower and narrower. And indeed, those researchers deal more with a kind of Putin courts and what kind of elites are included in these courts, reported about a kind of decreasing number of those who are in the inner circles of Putin in the recent years. So those one who are probably excluded from that a kind of inner circle are those one who eventually could have at least interests, yes, to defect to the regime and to revolt. However, it's not only the one option that Russian business have. Even those ones that became to be outsiders, they still have a kind of a lot of other options to go for. So first of all, they can choose exit. Yeah, so it's like try to get to another country. We saw increasing number of visas that a kind of business-related visas that were applied by Russian businessmen. Or they try to to redirect their businesses to non-Western markets. So of course, it depends how quickly it can happen, but we see the trends that Russian business became to be more involved in Southeastern Asian markets, China, and so on. So still, a kind of even being outsider out of this Kremlin circle does not mean that they will organize sort of protests or whatever to challenge the Kremlin rule. So some kind of competition will definitely come and is already in place, but to be more effective, we need a kind of to accelerate the shrinking of the rent-seeking pie that Kremlin has at its hands to share, and also to a kind of really to implement those sanctions effectively.
Right, and Kateryna, right to you.
I was just going to jump in. Sorry, I was just going to jump in to say, encourage the public with all so many interesting insights. You can start to put your questions in the chat if you have any, and then we will pick them up as we go, seeing as we have 10 more minutes and the discussion is really, really interesting. I don't want to break the flow too much. So yeah.
Exactly. So there you go.
Thank you. I think we need to talk about different types of sanctions. We have to start with trading sanction for certain sectors. And here we see that EU introduced a different level of sanctions, but so far they are not of huge size. They introducing sanctions on steel, they introducing sanction on coal, but all contracts are still eligible, and they will continue to work at least June or August. So we are postponing introducing sanction. Additionally, Europe is also introducing ban on export of equipment technologies, for example, for oil refinery sector and for defense and security sector. What we are seeing here, again, the existing contracts will continue to be eligible and the sanctions will be enacted only starting from June or even till from September. So we are seeing that this is not a huge reaction. We still have to wait till June or September to at least to these sanctions to be introduced. This is about trading. And again, as I mentioned, the huge amount of export and trade is on oil and gas. This is still for Europe is not sanctioned. So the hugest part of EU export is still working and it's still bringing money to Russia. If we look at sanctions on oligarchs or politically exposed persons, we are talking here only about freeze orders. We are not talking about confiscation of assets. This is a huge road to go from freeze orders to confiscation of assets. So temporarily, we don't know for how long, the oligarchs and PAPs are not allowed to use their fortune to have access to their money. But as for this period of time, it doesn't mean that this money will be at some point confiscated or they won't win the court battles over the decision on the freeze orders. If we look further on the financial system and sanctions on SWIFT, here we see some positive development, and we see that starting from the small banks that were first enacted by the sanction, we are slowly moving to bigger and bigger banks. So what I'm saying, this is a lot of sanctions, but it might be more. And the effect of these sanctions we will not see in any short-term perspective. So we have to do more and drive for more. Even for that sanction that we have, we are to enforce them and to look that they are really the requirements are fulfilled.
Wow. Joseph, please.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to very briefly build on what Ina mentioned, because I could not agree more with what she said. I honestly think that it's not been said enough in for the last couple of months. We have to be really careful with how we target these Russian oligarchs, because in the same way that now we appreciate how, I mean, besides the huge humanitarian catastrophe that it has created, Russian actions have, in one way at least, galvanized NATO's position, an organization that was going through a period of crisis for already a few years. In the same way, now Western sanctions against Russian oligarchs could potentially also galvanize them around Putin and the political elite, because they end up without any other option. We need to remember that in many cases, these European capitals and North America, they were safe havens for those money. I mean, there is a reason why so many corrupt politicians, not just in Asia, but also in Africa, they hid their money and they buy properties in the West, because when everything else fails, they can rely on the rule of law in the West. So by pushing anyone that had already kind of transferred away from the circle of Putin and into the West and sanctioning them, we are again pushing them back into the fold. So we need to be extremely careful with how we address these issues. And that's just wanted to add to what Ina said.
Francis.
Yeah, if I could just jump in. One thing which we don't discuss nearly often enough in this whole thing is what the sanctions are actually for, what we're aiming to achieve by implementing these sanctions. And it seems to me we have a whole load of different and possibly even contradictory aims that we're trying to. Do we want to punish Russia? Are we trying for regime change? Are we trying for policy change and then just an end to the war? Are we just, it was like waging war, at one remove? Are we attempting to generate discontent within Russia? Are we attempting to stop the war? Or are we doing it for our own internal Western political reasons? We must be seen to do something. And you can't really assess the effectiveness or otherwise of any particular sanctions unless you've got some kind of clarity of what you're trying to achieve in the first place. And that seems to me to be the thing which is missing at the moment. I don't know what the other panelists think about this.
Well, I would like to go to Oksana and then to Kateryna.
Francis, excellent question. What are the sanctions for? And I think the wish of Ukrainians or of the public is to end the war as soon as possible. It means to cut Russia off the income, of the possibilities to finance, and maybe to fragment even more the elites, that there is no strong vertical as it used to be. But what I see really, it's not what people wish, but what European elites maybe are doing. I see that their aim is rather on a mid or longer term to make Europe less dependent on Russia through less dependency on energy, maybe in face or in fear of the further extension of the war towards the NATO states. So I see indeed this discrepancy that you pointed out. And maybe on this critical point that Kateryna mentioned, how little we see of factual sanctions in comparison to the rhetoric, I think the problem is also when we speak about sanctions, it raises the impression that Russia, this is only Russia to blame in this war. But what we are discussing right now, that there are whole networks that are transnational, that are to blame in this war. And if we speak of sanctions, and maybe this is also the answer why there is so much hesitation, that all the enablers and elites in West, they are somehow interwoven and closely connected to the decisions and to all these dependencies. So again, to come back with what I started about these functions of blackmail and krugovaya poruka, of this circle that is created by corruption, usually by political level corruption, they are very dangerous. And I think the way out here is for Western countries to show that democracy is still working and that the rule of law is working, and to target even those enablers together with the sanctions. So speak not only of oligarchs, but also of those networks of enablers, and to reflect and to learn from what happens. So is it normal that the former chancellor is working for the foreign company for strategic purposes? Is it normal? Is it democratic? Is it legitimate, right? If it's not even illegal, but then it's definitely illegitimate. And I see very little of this reflection and very little of this discussion going on in the public now.
I'm passing to Kateryna and then to Ina. I hope, Oana, it's okay. We're a bit over time.
It's fine. I think we have a couple more minutes and then we will have to wrap up. But yeah, please do give us your insights in this last stretch.
Thank you. I think that this discussion about whether sanctions work or they do not work bring us to more global issues, not only related to Ukraine or to Russia, but the whole anti-money laundering system, global anti-money laundering system. What we are seeing through the strategic corruption or through the low effectiveness of sanction, that we have huge issues. One of them is transparency of beneficial ownership. It's a global issue. It's everywhere. We don't know who are behind the companies. Even if we know this information is not verified, or even if this information is wrong, we don't have any possibilities to sanction for this. Second, what we see that non-financial sector, such as lawyers, or how you call them, enablers, notaries, and others, they are not fully responsible for their compliance, for the work they are doing. And here we also have to look at this. And this is a global issue. This is not only about West, Ukraine, Russia. It's just a global issue. The third is about quality of supervision, how we look at what is going on within the bank or within the enablers, or how we can supervise enforcement of the sanctions in real world. So I guess that this war brings so many topics to the surface that we knew before. For sure, they're not new for us, but now we have to understand that they are global and there should be solutions. Otherwise, it is not the last war or not the last issue what we have been facing.
Ina, please.
Okay, so probably a shorter remark. Francis, I think that the main principle, unfortunately, for the sanctions is not so much what kind of goal achieve to, what kind of effect to achieve on Russian government behavior, but rather how much those sanctions will cost us in the West. And so the idea is that it should cost as less as possible. This is the sense or the rationale behind having this gradual approach in sanctions, which is a kind of, we know all from research, is pretty ineffective, because a kind of, if you want to achieve something, you need really to introduce a kind of powerful leverage on a authoritarian regime. So the justification for this is usually that we are not prepared and we need a kind of time to prepare for whatever sanctions need to come. This is probably also the reason why some trade sanctions will come into effect only in summer, and why the whole discussions about energy restrictions with the perspective of years, not only months. I think so. for whatever reasons, but definitely due to these informal networks between Western politicians and Russian state and business, we are pretty much unprepared in the West, while Russia, and this is another point, prepared pretty well. Yes, so they had elaborated on alternative kind of channels of financial integration. We have a sort of alternative project even for SWIFT. So there were some ideas, there are some scenarios for whatever sanctions may come from the Western side. And with certain level of success, Russian both political and business elites are already well prepared for what we are just thinking about to introduce in terms of sanctions, unfortunately, yeah.
I would like to give Kateryna also the comment.
Yeah.
Ah, no, you have a hand. Okay.
Sorry.
Wow, so it seems like we have raised here lots of issues that concern not only strategic corruption at the state level in Russia, but also all the enabling conditions here in the West. And I even would love to have another panel discussing what can we do about these sanctions, like steel, coal, or like step by step. We have to think together how to make them more functioning. Maybe my observation at the end, to summarize, it seems like the economy and the financial system in the West never was thought in the terms of security. They were as separate, like economy, politics, they are separate, and security is even something third, which is left for military to solve. And that is probably the problem, why even whatever military equipment Ukraine gets from Germany, it suddenly doesn't work. And then we are sitting in front of the Nord Stream 2 and being very dependent. So I think we need some kind of a change of a paradigm, how we bring these three spheres together and work from there. Thanks a lot for very insightful discussion. I personally learned a lot.
Oh, thank you all very much. I have to echo all of the Oleksandra and Francis comments, and I think we have turned the question on different faces, and so that's what created a lot of insight in this discussion. Thank you all for contributing such valuable points of view. I have also learned a lot. It seemed that the tone was a little bit pessimistic, but actually I would say it was a realistic dissection of the problems that we're facing, and never before has globalization looked like such a big problem for all of us. But it is important to understand it and to understand the roots of the problem in order to start to figure out solutions. So even though we were maybe not able to articulate those solutions now, we have managed to critically think about the weaknesses of the sanctions that have been imposed so far. It's actually like a cold shower, even to me, just to hear how superficial the sanctions have been thus far. And I think the audience will appreciate that this discussion will raise awareness about these problems. And I think it is important that the public is involved in this discussion more and more, because we need to hold our politicians accountable. And we can do that if we have the knowledge about the implications of the policies at the moment. And I just wanted to end with a slightly more positive thought, in that I've seen recent research by economist Armin Falk and colleagues from Germany, who have sent out a survey to German citizens, asking them about the level of support for Ukraine. And the vast majority, it will come as no surprise, the vast majority of people support the Ukrainian defense and would like to stop the bloodshed, and would be willing to pay to stop the bloodshed in terms of higher energy prices and in terms of shifting sources of energy, even though that comes at a high cost. So I think that's kind of a hint of hope that we see when people are engaged in the conversation. And it's critical, because we know democracy works based on votes and popularity of politicians. So it is important to see that actually drastic sanctions and the reduction of dependence on Russian resources actually does have popular support. And I think more research from other countries is needed in that respect. Thank you all very, very much, Kateryna, Joseph, Ina, Oksana, and of course, Oleksandra and Francis. Wonderful discussion. We will meet again on the 28th of April at 2 p.m. We will have a different set of panelists who will discuss a little bit more about where hopes come from. And one of the sources of hope is the burgeoning civil society in Ukraine, and the wonderful involvement of everyone in getting the country out of crisis or mitigating the effects of the conflict. So yeah, thank you all very, very much. Hope to see you then. And I shall be in touch with the speakers of today regarding how to circulate the event from today. All right.
Thank you
Hope all of
all.
you have a good holiday or a good Easter break if you can, and we'll be in touch.
Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.